Welcome back. Today's story filled with drama and unexpected turns. Hit like, subscribe, and let's jump in.
I felt relieved watching my son and daughter head out. It was comforting to see them and know they were there for me. I had spent some quiet time with Ethan, handing over the business and ensuring he was ready to take charge. He was majoring in business and planned to run the company in the future, though not right away. Isabella wasn't interested in the business, but she was happy to support Ethan if he needed help. They were wonderful children, and I was proud of both. I hadn't seen my wife, Sophia, and I made sure she couldn't enter my room. I didn't want to speak to her. Her actions forced me into a situation I couldn't forgive her for. The kids begged me to reconcile, but I refused. I didn't want to talk to her anymore. Now it was time to speak to my lawyer. He was court-appointed since I had turned over all of my assets and power of attorney to my son, so I had no funds of my own. The nurse told me he was here, and I agreed to talk with him. The nurse told him not to stay too long. She made sure he understood that I was still weak and still in pain, and the medications might make me groggy. She told me to press the call button if I needed her, and with a smile, she left the room. The man assigned to my case was a very large and poorly dressed man who had obviously seen better days. He asked if he could take down my story, both in longhand and on tape. I guessed he wasn't very quick with a pen, so I assented. It was quite a story, but most of you have already read about some of it in the papers. I was told that it was also on TV. How about that? Well, I'll try to fill in the gaps, but it won't really change much. This is my story. My name is David Cross, and my wife is Sophia Cross. We've been married 25 years, and we have 2 children, Ethan and Isabella. They are in college. Ethan is a senior, and Isabella a sophomore. They both go to Somerset University. I graduated in 1986, went to work as an engineer for a local civil engineering firm, and learned enough to leave in 1994 to start my own business. You may have heard of it, Cross Build Company. Our business is in construction, primarily large projects like shopping centers and office buildings. I've been in business for almost 21 years now, starting with a small crew and growing into a major business with 118 employees. Sophia and I met in college. We were both local, and we shared a course our senior year, hers as a major and mine as an elective. She was a business major, and that was her field. I was trying to fill academic credit requirements. To make a long story short, we met, she was willing to help me learn enough to pass the course, and we began dating. We dated all through that senior year. After graduation, she found a job with a financial firm, and we were able to see each other fairly often. We married a year later. She continued to work until Ethan came along. She finally stopped in her 7th month, staying home afterward with Ethan, and then, about a year and a half later, Isabella was born. Sophia was a great mother and homemaker, and she seemed happy to be both. As the kids grew, she became a typical soccer mom, running the kids everywhere and managing everything. She was content. Our life as husband and wife was typical. We had our ups and downs early on with money worries and later with pressures from the kids and their needs. We always seemed to find the time to be with each other, and we had a good life together for the most part. I loved her, and I thought she loved me. Our sex life was good, then bad, and sometimes non-existent, and then on again. We had finally settled into a comfortable routine of sex on weekends, and sometimes during the week if both of us were in the mood. Our sex was conventional, some might say vanilla, but she was always satisfied, and I never had a problem. She often said that sex was just good fun and that I was all she needed. I felt the same way. I'd say that things changed about a year after Isabella left for college. While the kids were close enough that we could see them fairly often, they chose to stay on campus. This gave Sophia free time that she hadn't had since the kids were born. I guess you could say she had time on her hands. It was okay for a while, but then boredom got the upper hand. We had the conversation, as I now think of it, one weekend. We were sitting out on the patio with our weekly ration of wine when she let me have the introduction. David, I've been thinking I'd like to go back to work. I've kept up in my field, and I think I could do some temporary work in accounting or bookkeeping. What would you think about it? Well, first, I need to catch up with you. Where did this come from? It's the first I've heard about it. I've just been thinking, with the kids gone, I'm left without a lot to do. The house is no trouble, and we haven't joined any clubs or such. I'm bored. You're working a lot more lately, and I'm alone in the evenings with nothing to do and nobody to talk to. Well, I guess that's true. We don't need the money, even with the kids in college. But you should have some you could call your own. Do you really want to do this? Yes, I do. I was thinking I could sign up with a temporary agency and tell them I'd like to work just a couple of days a week. Maybe just 2. What do you think? I'd say go for it, you have my support. Well, that was the beginning of the end, as I remember it now. That's exactly what she did. She went down the next day and signed up with a local temp service, and over the next 6 months, she worked off and on for several clients and seemed to be doing well. She wasn't making a lot of money, but she seemed to like being busy again. I noticed a change in her around that time. She joined a gym, started working out, and began losing weight. She bought herself some new clothes with her earnings, and she also spent some for the kids, giving them new jackets and a few other things they needed. She was also much more affectionate, initiating intimacy more often. I thought it had to do with her newfound conditioning and contentment with being busy. Actually, that's exactly what it was, at least for a while. Sophia continued to work off and on until one day in October of that year. I had come home from work concerned about some specs on a job I was bidding on when Sophia asked if she could talk to me. I told her yes, of course. I asked her to sit with me in my study, and I gave her my full attention. She seemed nervous, and I wanted to let her tell me whatever was bothering her. She sat down across from me, clasped her hands in her lap, wet her lips, and began. I was offered a job by a gentleman I've done work for several times. He's someone like you. He owns his own business and needs a part-time bookkeeper. He would only need me 2 days a week, for 4 hours each day. It would be from 5 to 9 in the evening, and he would even provide transportation so I wouldn't be alone at night. It's $1,180 a week. I considered this but couldn't see why it made her so nervous. It sounded like a good gig, and the pay was decent, nearly $1,023 per hour, better than she'd been making as a temp. I told her so and asked why she seemed so nervous. Well, it's an evening job, and I didn't know how you'd feel about that. It's only 2 nights a week, and I'd be home the rest of the time. It's good money for a few hours, and I could make plans knowing exactly when I was working. So, is it okay with you? It's fine with me. Can you tell me who he is and what he does? His name is Nathan Reeves, and he's in logistics. I think he owns a fleet of trucks that move goods across the country. He seems to be pretty well off. He has an office in his home, and that's where I'd be working. But there's also a staff on site, so I wouldn't be there alone. It's all legitimate. We agreed, and Sophia started the next week. I did a bit of checking and found that Nathan was indeed a recognized name in regional logistics, which aligned with what she'd told me. I found nothing concerning. I looked him up online and saw that he was about 10 years older than I was and unmarried, which seemed harmless. Sophia liked the job and was almost always home by 9:30, so we settled into a new routine, with her out 2 nights a week while I managed dinner on my own. She always came home full from the leftovers served to Mr. Garson for dinner, as she put it. Sophia said the cook brought her a plate when he ate. Life went on. Just before New Year's, Sophia told me she'd been invited to a cocktail party at Nathan's home one evening. It was for some of his clients, and he wanted her to meet some of them so she'd have a better sense of whom she was dealing with when she saw their names. She apologized for not inviting me, explaining it was Nathan's request. He didn't want her to think it was a social affair. It was strictly business. I told her I understood, or at least I tried to seem like I did, and she was pleased. On the night of the party, she came down dressed in a short black dress cut low in the front and deep in the back. She had on high heels and a string of pearls that I'd given her for Christmas the year before. It was the first time she'd worn them since I gave them to her. I was taken aback by her appearance, and I guess she sensed my discomfort. She immediately got defensive and irritated. You know why I dress this way? Nathan is a very important man, and he needs me to reflect that to his guests. It's professional, and it's strictly business. You have no reason to be upset. Don't you trust me? Of course, I trust you. But you've never dressed like that for any of my events, and I'm not sure I appreciate it. Well, get over it. This is important to me tonight, and I want to look my best. It's just a party, for God's sake. There's the car, I have to go. Don't wait up. With that, she was gone, and I was alone for the first time in years while my wife was at a party. I didn't like it, and I resented her for it. I pulled out a bottle of scotch and indulged myself. Apparently, I indulged too much, as I fell asleep on the couch and didn't hear a thing until late the next morning. Since it was Saturday, Sophia let me sleep. She finally woke me with a cup of coffee sometime after 10. She saw the empty glass and the bottle beside me and quickly pieced together what had happened. She hated for me to drink, and she told me so. She said she came home and went to bed, expecting me to be there, only to find me passed out downstairs. I apologized, and we spent a tense morning until she finally softened. The rest of the weekend went fine. New Year's came, and I had time off. Our kids came home, and we had a wonderful holiday together. Things were good. The kids were doing well and were happy at school, and we had some nice gifts, partly due to the extra money Sophia was bringing in. She was able to spend on a few treats for the kids, which they appreciated. The only downside was that Sophia had to work the Thursday after New Year's. We let it go, and the kids and I spent the evening together. It was a good holiday season, but it ended as holidays do, and the kids returned to school, while I went back to work. For the next month, nothing unusual happened until one day, I was having lunch with a client when he asked if I knew a man named Nathan Reeves. I told him I knew who he was and asked why he was interested. He told me he'd attended a party at Nathan's place just before New Year's and had met a woman with the same last name as mine. He described her as the hostess for the evening. For some reason, I didn't tell him that the hostess was my wife. I just asked why he'd mentioned it. He went on to say that she was a very beautiful woman and that she seemed to be more than just a hostess. Nathan had his arm around her all evening, and they even kissed a few times. My client wondered if it was anyone I knew. I told him no, and he just said that was a shame, as she was quite stunning, and Nathan was a lucky guy. He even joked that maybe Nathan had finally found a wife for himself. We finished lunch and parted ways, but as you can imagine, I was disturbed for the rest of the day. Eventually, I told my assistant that I was going home early. This was one of the days that Sophia worked for Nathan, so I knew she'd be getting ready to go to his place when I got home. Usually, she'd be gone by the time I arrived, as she worked from 5 onward, and I typically didn't get home until after 6. But this time, I was determined to see what I'd find. I drove home, curious and anxious, wondering what I might walk into. I pulled into the driveway and went inside to find Sophia just stepping out of the shower. She told me she had spent the day gardening and got dirty, so she decided to shower quickly before work. She dressed in a conservative pair of slacks and a blouse, ready for her shift. Grabbing her briefcase, she set it in the hallway and came in to talk, asking why I was home so early. I explained that I wasn't feeling well, that my stomach was upset, and I had a headache. She seemed concerned, tried to take my temperature, but I brushed her aside and told her to just go to her job, I'd take care of myself. The truth was, I wasn't physically sick, I was angry, confused, and uncertain about my wife. I was hot under the collar, not from any fever, but I kept those feelings to myself. Sophia accepted my story and, concerned, did something unexpected. She went to the phone in the kitchen, called someone, and told them she wouldn't be coming in that night, asking them not to send the car. She promised she'd call later to reschedule if she needed to come in another time. She then hung up and returned to me. There, now you don't need to worry. I'm not going in, so you can just relax. I'll take care of you. Go up to bed, and I'll fix some tea and bring it up to you. I went to bed, wondering how my life had spiraled out of control without my realizing it. I wrestled with why I was so quick to assume my wife was cheating on me, based only on rumors from a party and suspicions in my own head. I began piecing together details. She was working at a man's home, he was sending a car for her, and she often seemed too tired for intimacy on the nights she worked. She'd been buying things for the kids we couldn't really afford, justifying it by saying that she'd pay for it from her earnings. Yet, the amount she was spending didn't add up. Then there was the visual confirmation from my client, who saw her at the New Year's party, where he described her as acting more like Nathan's partner than just an employee. I decided to investigate further over the next few days. That night, I let her care for me as she promised, and the next day, I returned to work with a plan. I needed to confirm my suspicions by checking her briefcase. She kept it locked when she was home, but I knew where she hid the key. Sophia and Isabella usually had a long phone call on certain nights, catching up for about 30 or 40 minutes. During their call, I intended to search her briefcase. Just after 9, Isabella called. I waited for a few minutes, then went into our bedroom and straight to her closet. Her briefcase was there, and earlier, I'd slipped the key from her keyring. I took the briefcase into the spare bedroom and unlocked it. Inside, I found nothing related to accounting or bookkeeping, no papers, calculator, or notebooks. It seemed more like a prop than a real briefcase for work. I almost closed it back up, but I decided to go further and searched all the compartments. In one of the side pockets, I found a single photograph. Pulling it out, I felt my stomach drop. In the photo, Sophia was in bed with another man, caught in an intimate moment, her eyes closed, her face filled with an expression of pleasure. I barely made it to the bathroom in time to empty the contents of my stomach. The nausea, the anger, the shock, they all washed over me, clenching my gut in a grip that felt as if it would never loosen. I eventually composed myself, went back, and took one last look at the photo. Turning it over, I found an inscription on the back, "I have many more of these, so just remember that." It was signed simply with an S, and I assumed that was for Nathan. Instead of returning the photo, I tucked it into my wallet behind my driver's license. Let her wonder where it had gone. I replaced everything else, locked the briefcase, and returned it to the closet. For the next 10 minutes, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to gather my thoughts and decide what to do. Now, I knew. Sophia was not only cheating on me, she was also being blackmailed, or at least threatened. From the look on her face in that picture, it was clear she was a willing participant. She was choosing this, which was even harder to accept. I couldn't believe she'd gotten in so deep without ever giving me a single warning that she was unhappy in our marriage. If she had, maybe we could have worked through it, or ended things amicably. But not like this. Finally, I decided I was going to insist she quit. I wasn't sure I could forgive her, but I was willing to try if she'd walk away from Nathan and end things immediately. I still loved her, and I didn't want to lose our family. That night, after her phone call, I told her that I'd been thinking, and I wanted her to quit her job. She was caught off guard and didn't respond at first, but then she started explaining all the reasons she shouldn't quit. I listened, but nothing she said mattered to me. We argued back and forth for the next 2 hours, but I remained adamant. She eventually went to bed in tears, and I slept in the guest room. The next morning, I went to work without speaking to her, trying to make sense of my own feelings and what the next steps might be. I knew that her decision would be the deciding factor in what happened between us. When I came home that evening, I found her waiting at the kitchen table. She came to me, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, "I'll call tomorrow and resign. I can't go on like this, with you sleeping away from me and us not talking. No job is worth that. I love you, David, and I'm not going to lose you." With that, she picked up the phone, called someone, and told them she wouldn't be coming back. She agreed to meet with Nathan the following day at his office to formally resign. Turning to me, she gave a reassuring smile, saying, "Everything will be better now. I'll resign tomorrow, and we can work together to make things like they used to be." At that point, I decided to try to save my marriage. I know all the reasons why I should have walked away, but I couldn't bring myself to end things that way. For whatever reason, I couldn't see myself living without her. I chose not to confront her with what I knew. I'd forgive her and try to move forward. The next day at work, everything went sideways. We were working on a shopping center project in the south end of the city, pushing hard to meet a tight deadline before the holiday shopping rush. We were on schedule, and things were moving along until that day. Suddenly, our deliveries of concrete, steel beams, and other materials were delayed, misrouted, or outright cancelled. It continued like this all day and into the next, with no resolution in sight. I spent hours on the phone with suppliers and contractors, but all of them claimed they weren't responsible, they'd shipped everything as scheduled. No one could explain why the deliveries never made it to the site. I was stumped and getting angrier by the minute. Then, like a punch to the gut, I remembered what Nathan Reeves did for a living. He was in logistics and transportation. He controlled the shipping and trucking routes in the region. Now, everything clicked into place. I realized he was deliberately sabotaging my business because I had forced Sophia to quit. He wasn't willing to let go of her, and he was using his power to blackmail me into submission. I didn't know what to do without any proof, but I wasn't about to let him walk over me. Just as I was sitting there, fuming and plotting my next steps, my assistant buzzed in to tell me there was a Mr. Garson waiting to see me. I was taken aback but decided right then and there that I was going to confront him. I told her to send him in. Nathan Reeves was a tall man, a few inches taller than me, and he carried a solid frame, probably a good 50 pounds heavier than me. His skin had the kind of tan that hinted at tropical vacations, and his salt and pepper hair looked carefully styled, but casually so. His jacket and trousers were clearly high-end, probably costing more than a month of my salary. He strode into my office and offered his hand, but I left mine at my side and simply told him to sit. The slight flash of irritation in his eyes told me he got the message. He sat down and got right to the point without any preamble. You know who I am, and I'm sure you understand why I'm here. I'll be direct, I want Sophia to return to work for me under the same arrangement. In fact, I'll increase her pay to $2,200 a week, up from the $1,500 she's been receiving. She can continue her duties as we agreed, and in return, your business will go back to normal, with the added bonus of preferential treatment in scheduling. This way, you have your wife almost all of the time, and I have her for just 8 hours a week. We both get what we want. He paused, waiting for my response, but I stayed silent, letting him continue to talk. Now that we understand each other, I may also ask her to attend certain gatherings at my home, and I'll provide a bonus for each one, of course. If you'd prefer, I can arrange for the bonus to be paid directly to you. I felt my blood boiling, but I kept my face neutral. He went on, I don't expect an answer today. I want Sophia to be at my home Thursday night, as usual. If she doesn't show up, I'll be forced to take further action. Am I clear? With that, he stood up and left my office, leaving me to sit there, stunned and furious. I stewed in my office for the next 15 minutes, replaying his words in my head. It was clear he could ruin my business if he wanted to. He controlled the transportation logistics that my company depended on, and he was willing to use that power against me. My marriage was in shambles, and now my business was hanging by a thread. When I got home that evening, Sophia was already gone. I found her briefcase missing and a note on the kitchen table. It simply said, "Went to work. See you tonight. Love, Sophia." I read it twice, trying to absorb the meaning. She'd gone back to Nathan, without talking to me, without a word of explanation. She'd chosen to return to him without so much as a discussion. That was the final straw. Just after 7 that evening, I knocked on the door of Nathan's house. A young woman, dressed as a maid, answered and asked what I needed. I introduced myself and told her Mr. Garson had invited me over to discuss a business proposal. She gave me a hesitant, almost sympathetic look but invited me into the entryway, asking me to wait while she informed him I was there. I thanked her and, as she walked away, quietly followed her down the hall. She picked up a phone on the wall, pushed a button, and began speaking hurriedly, explaining something to someone on the other end. When she hung up, she shook her head and disappeared into another part of the house. I moved further in, eventually finding the staircase leading to the second floor. I waited at the bottom, just out of sight, and listened. A door opened, and I saw Nathan emerge from one of the rooms, tying a robe around his waist. I heard Sophia's voice from inside, but I couldn't make out her words. Nathan seemed agitated and shut the door on her as he came down the stairs. As he passed, I stepped out from my hiding spot and followed him silently. He walked into a sitting room, looking around for me, and I made my entrance. When he saw me, he smiled broadly and spread his arms in a gesture of welcome. "Ah, Mr. Farrow. I'm glad you came. I know Sophia will be thrilled that you've come around to our arrangement. She and I have been enjoying each other's company tonight, and I knew you'd see the light." He continued, "You'll forgive me, but I told her you'd accepted my terms. She's quite happy, I assure you. But I don't imagine you'd be comfortable staying, so I'll wish you good night." With that, he turned toward the door, but I wasn't done. I pulled out a small revolver, an old .38, and aimed it at him. "I'm not leaving yet, Nathan," I said. He stopped in his tracks, surprise flickering across his face. Then, he quickly composed himself, probably used to talking people down when they were upset. He took a step toward me, his tone calm and soothing. "David," he began, "let's not do anything rash." I watched him, still impressed by his coolness, but I wasn't swayed. "Yeah, you're good under pressure," I said, just before pulling the trigger. I fired 3 times, each shot finding its mark. The first bullet hit him in the face, the second between the eyes, and the third in the neck. He fell, his face frozen in a mix of shock and pain. Behind me, I heard screaming, but I didn't turn around. I thought I heard Sophia's voice, calling my name, but I couldn't be sure. Satisfied that Nathan was dead, I raised the gun to my own head and pulled the trigger. The last thing I remember was the flash and then blackness. I don't know why I'm not dead. Sometimes, I wonder if maybe I am. I woke up in the hospital with a headache that felt like hell itself. Maybe this was my punishment, or my afterlife. But no, I was alive. The doctors told me it had been several weeks since I shot Nathan and myself. Someone had grabbed my hand just as I pulled the trigger, causing the bullet to graze my skull and exit just below my chin. They told me I was lucky. Lucky. That's a matter of perspective when you're trying to kill yourself. Once I was well enough for visitors, the doctor told me that my family was here and wanted to see me. I'd been unconscious for the first 3 weeks and aware for only the past few days. He hadn't allowed visitors before now, worried about my mental state. He told me I'd been shouting in my sleep, but they couldn't make out who I was angry with. He said I could see my son first if I was ready. I agreed to see my son first. Ethan came into the room, looking cautious but determined, as if he'd prepared himself for this meeting. We went through the usual reassurances. He told me he was fine, that Sophia was fine, that Isabella was fine, all the standard updates meant to ease my mind. Then he finally got to the heart of it. "Dad, why won't you see Mom? What happened?" He leaned forward, his voice pleading. "You have to tell me. She's outside, and she's been crying and making a scene, demanding to see you. Tell me what's going on. I need to know." I looked at my son. He was nearly a college graduate, a young man I'd been preparing to take over the business. But now, he would have to take over more than just the company. He'd have to shoulder the family, too. I decided to tell him the truth, hoping he was ready for it, and that he'd be able to handle the weight of it. "Ethan, things are going to get worse before they get better," I began, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "I'm in serious trouble, and I'll probably be going to prison for a long time. You're going to need to take control of my assets and the business, and I'll help you transfer everything over. But to understand what's happened, you need to hear the whole story." "Go ahead, Dad. I'll listen." "First, you need to know that your mother has been Nathan Reeves's mistress for the past 7 months. He was paying her for work 2 nights a week. She'd been getting $1,500 a week for it." I watched his face, but he stayed silent, letting me continue. "I found out about it and confronted her, and I told her to quit. I didn't tell her that I knew exactly what she was doing, but I told her to leave the job. She quit, but Nathan wasn't pleased, and he started using his trucking network to tie up our business deliveries and pressure me into letting her return. Then he came to my office. He offered to increase her pay and continue their arrangement if I'd let her go back to him. I refused, but she went anyway. I went to his house that night, saw them together, and well, you know the rest. I shot him and tried to shoot myself." Ethan sat there in silence, absorbing everything. I'd had time to come to grips with all of this, but he was hearing it for the first time. His face was pale, and I could see tears welling up in his eyes. He stared down at his hands for a few moments, then he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It can't be true," he said, shaking his head. "Mom wouldn't do that." I took a deep breath. "Look in my wallet," I said, pointing to the nightstand. "There's a picture behind my driver's license. Take a look." He got up, retrieved my wallet, and found the photo. Turning it over, he read the inscription. He didn't say a word, but the tears started flowing. I watched as he tried to process it all, and finally, he just crumpled into the chair beside me, the weight of the truth crushing him. We sat together for a while, saying nothing. I gave him the time he needed. I could tell he was shattered. After several long minutes, he stood up and looked at me. "I have to go," he said quietly. I told him he could do whatever he wanted with the photo, and he just nodded, pocketing it as he left the room. I felt terrible for him, but I needed him to know the truth. He was the only one I trusted with it. After Ethan left, Isabella came in. She was her usual loving self, concerned about me, and we talked. But I didn't tell her the real reason I wouldn't see Sophia. I simply told her to speak with her brother. She was hurt that I wouldn't open up, but she could tell I wasn't in a place to share any more than I already had. For the next 3 days, Ethan and Isabella continued to visit, and each time, they told me that Sophia was outside, asking to see me. Finally, Ethan insisted that I let her in, if only to stop her from creating a scene in the waiting room. He asked if he could come in with her, hoping to make things easier for me. I agreed, reluctantly, only because he asked. The next day, during visiting hours, Sophia followed Ethan into the room. I was able to sit up by this point, and most of the bandages had been removed. Sophia stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me, her face shifting from a tentative smile to shock, then to tears. She looked horrified. "Oh, David, you look terrible," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't realize it was this bad. "Are you in pain? What have you done to yourself?" I felt nothing but contempt for her in that moment. "Well, hello to you too, Sophia," I replied coldly. "Thanks for the compliments. No, I don't feel any pain, at least, not from the wound." I took a long pause, then added, "I guess I should thank you for ruining my shot and preventing me from killing myself. The doctors tell me it was you who stopped me. But I won't thank you. I wish I'd succeeded. You know why." My words struck her like a slap. She looked at me, stunned, as if she had no idea what I meant. She glanced over at Ethan, clearly uncomfortable with his presence, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of privacy. There was a brief flash of anger in her eyes, and she took a deep breath. "I don't know why you'd want to kill yourself, David. You knew what I was doing, and Nathan told me you'd agreed to his terms. I thought we could still be a family, that we could move past this. I was willing to testify for you, to say Nathan threatened me and that you were only defending me. We can work this out, David." I let out a bitter laugh. "You think I agreed to that? I never agreed to anything. I came home to talk to you about it, but you were already gone, to him. You couldn't wait to get your next paycheck, could you?" She shook her head, looking stricken, and I continued. "For your information, I have no intention of fighting this in court. I told my attorney to plead guilty. I'll pay for my crime. It's too bad you weren't there just a little sooner. Maybe we could all have been dead by now, me, you, and Nathan. But now, you walk away free while I pay the price. Congratulations." Sophia's face crumpled, and she looked ready to faint. Ethan grabbed her arm and led her to a chair, and she slumped into it, completely devastated. He turned back to me, anger flashing in his eyes. "Why would you do this to her in front of me?" he demanded. "You have every right to be angry, but not in front of me. You're the one who's been wronged, but that doesn't give you the right to humiliate her like this." "You're right, Ethan," I replied, ashamed for dragging him into it. "I'm sorry. But you have to understand the pain I feel just seeing her. I let her in because you asked, but I never wanted to see or speak to her again. I hate her for what she's done to us, and I can't move past it." Ethan looked at me, his expression softening. "If you go with the self-defense argument, Dad, you might get off with probation. Do it for Isabella and me, if not for her." "Not a chance," I said firmly. "I want nothing from her. She couldn't resist the money, so she sold herself for cash. I won't ever accept anything from her again." Sophia had overheard this, and she stumbled out of the room, leaving Ethan and me alone. He stayed a few minutes longer, discussing business matters before leaving as well. I knew Sophia was unlikely to return, and I was relieved by that. Now that Ethan and Isabella knew the truth, she'd have to face the consequences of her choices. Over the next couple of weeks, I met with my lawyer several times to prepare for the preliminary hearing. I had made it clear to him that I would plead guilty, and all he had to do was determine which charge the Assistant District Attorney, ADA, would pursue, whether it would be first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter, each with varying degrees of severity. My lawyer knew I wanted this over quickly and would accept a guilty plea. He didn't entirely agree with my approach but understood that I was determined. Just before the court date, my lawyer rushed into my room, slightly out of breath, and told me the ADA wanted to meet with us in private before the hearing. I was caught off guard and asked why, but my lawyer was as surprised as I was. We followed the ADA to a small conference room outside the courtroom, where he began speaking directly to my attorney as though I weren't even there. "There's no question about Mr. Farrow's guilt," he began, glancing briefly in my direction. "I believe we could prove that he shot Nathan Reeves with premeditation. However, we've received statements from 3 witnesses who claim he acted in defense of his wife. These witnesses are credible and could introduce a lot of reasonable doubt in court. Plus, let's just say that Nathan wasn't well liked in certain circles, and there's little public interest in prosecuting his killer." I was shocked. 3 witnesses. I had no idea who these people could be. Before I could ask, my lawyer signaled for me to stay silent. The ADA continued, explaining that his office wasn't interested in a trial that might open up questions about Nathan's business dealings and associates. He looked like a man over a barrel, and he wanted a way out. My lawyer quickly seized the opportunity. "No jail time," my lawyer said confidently. "Probation, community service, and we'll waive the right to a jury trial. How does that sound?" The ADA hesitated, considering his options, then gave a resigned nod. "Fine. I'll make the recommendation, but the final decision is up to the judge. Be ready to sign the paperwork." He left the room, and my lawyer turned to me with a rare smile, saying, "We got exactly what we wanted, David. The ADA is backing off, and with his recommendation, the judge is very likely to accept the plea deal. You'll be free to go, no jail time, no trial." It took less than an hour before the ADA returned, and my lawyer signed the paperwork on my behalf. The ADA handed me a copy without a glance, clearly displeased, and left as quickly as he'd come. My lawyer looked at the documents one more time, then handed them to me with a grin. "You're free, David," he said. "Since you were never formally arraigned, and the ADA dropped all charges, there's no record against you. You don't even have probation or community service. You're free to go." Just like that, it was over. I had killed a man in cold blood, with full intent, and then tried to take my own life. But no one seemed interested in making me pay for it. For a moment, I felt a strange emptiness, not quite sure what to do with this unexpected freedom. As we left the conference room, I spotted Ethan and Isabella waiting with Sophia and another woman I didn't recognize. They must have heard the news from the ADA because Ethan's face lit up with a wide grin when he saw me. Isabella ran to me, wrapping her arms around my neck and holding on tightly. Ethan reached out for a handshake, smiling proudly. Sophia, on the other hand, hung back, watching me with a mixture of relief and sadness. I acknowledged her with a quick, detached glance and then looked away. She and the other woman, who I assumed was her attorney, turned and left, deep in conversation. I was glad to see her go. I didn't want her to be any part of my life from here on out. Over the next few months, I moved into a small apartment about 5 miles from my old home. It wasn't much, but it suited me just fine. I took back control of the business from Ethan, who was relieved to return to college and finish his degree. He promised to help me run the company when he graduated, but for now, he was focused on his studies. Isabella went back to school as well, and I understood that she stayed close with her mother. Ethan, however, remained distant from Sophia. They spoke occasionally, but the bond they once shared had been deeply strained by everything that had happened. I had no contact with Sophia and wanted it to stay that way. About a year later, I received notice from an attorney that Sophia had filed for divorce. Since we lived in a no-fault state, the grounds were simply irreconcilable differences. She was asking for the house and half of our financial assets, but she didn't make any claims on the business or future earnings. It was fair enough, and I signed the paperwork immediately, making a small note to exclude a savings account listed in her name, which held over $181,000. I had no interest in any money that came from her relationship with Nathan. The divorce process took another 6 months, during which all our assets were split between separate accounts. My lawyer and Sophia's handled everything, and I was spared from having to interact with her directly. By the time the divorce was finalized, I had almost completely recovered. The only lasting effects of my failed suicide attempt were a slight tremor in my right hand and some scarring along my jawline. After the divorce, I settled into a new routine, focusing on my work and reconnecting with my kids. 5 years later, I handed the business over to Ethan, who'd graduated and was ready to take the reins. With my savings and investments, I bought a modest boat and spent the next few years traveling up and down the coast. I made a point of calling Ethan and Isabella regularly, and they visited when they could. They kept me updated on Sophia, though I didn't ask. Ethan mentioned that she'd remarried, oddly enough, to the same client who'd told me about her behavior at Nathan's party. I found it ironic, but it didn't bother me. In a way, it felt like a fitting end to that chapter. Then, about a year after I began my travels, I received a strange phone call. A woman introduced herself as Lila Monroe and said she had information about Nathan Reeves that I might find interesting. I was taken aback but dismissed it at first, telling her that I wanted nothing to do with anything related to that time in my life. She left a phone number, urging me to reconsider, saying I had only 48 hours to contact her. After that, she said, she'd be gone, and the truth would go with her. At first, I dismissed it as a trick or a scam. But that evening, as I sat alone in my small cabin, the idea nagged at me. Maybe there was something left to learn, something that might finally let me close the book on Nathan and Sophia. The next morning, I called the number, and she answered right away. We arranged to meet at a nearby cafe, where she'd find me. That afternoon, a beautiful woman who looked to be about my age slipped into the seat across from me. She introduced herself as Lila Monroe, and I took in her appearance, long dark hair, brown eyes, and an air of elegance that spoke of money. She introduced herself with a calm composure that surprised me, given what she was about to tell me. Mr. Farrow, thank you for meeting with me. I understand that revisiting your past is difficult, but I think you deserve to know the full story. She paused, looking directly into my eyes. I was with Nathan and Sophia the night you shot Nathan. You never knew who the third witness was that claimed you acted in self-defense. Well, it was me. I convinced the authorities that you had no choice, that Nathan had pushed you too far. My heart pounded as she spoke, and I listened, stunned, as she continued. Nathan Reeves was a cruel man, Mr. Farrow, and he controlled far more than just his trucking company. He had ties to organized crime, and he used his business to launder money from drug operations and illegal gambling. He also smuggled people and contraband. He was feared, and he had very few friends. Emily explained that she'd worked in Nathan's house as his personal assistant and confidant, a position she took out of financial desperation. She told me how Nathan had manipulated and coerced both her and Sophia, using money, threats, and blackmail to keep them compliant. Over time, she became aware of Nathan's secrets, and when I showed up that night, she saw it as her chance to break free from his control. She, along with a few others in the house, corroborated the story of self-defense, ensuring I would go free. When she was finished, I sat there, stunned, not knowing what to say. Emily looked at me, her eyes softening as she prepared to leave. Sophia made mistakes, but she never stopped loving you. She was caught in something she couldn't control, but she did everything she could to protect you and your family. I wanted you to know that. With that, she left the cafe, disappearing from my life as quickly as she had entered it. I sat there for a long time, turning over her words. In some way, they helped me let go of the last of my anger. I would never forgive Sophia completely, but I could finally accept the truth and move forward. What would you do in David's shoes? Forgive or walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.